Hi everyone. Let's continue our series about nutrition. And today I'm going to talk about the concept of energy balance, which is fundamental in the process of weight loss. So, the basic concept from which we must begin is the definition of calories. What are calories? Is something you burn? Is something that you eat? Let's clear the space. Calories are energy, and I mean literally energy. Calories actually refer to the energy that can be extracted from the nutrients, food in other words, you consume. Calories are a unit of measurement of heat. When we talk about calories, we are referring to kilocalories or kcal. So when you read food labels, the calories listed there are actually kilocalories, which means 1000 calories. In science, calorie is defined as the amount of energy necessary to heat up 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. However, the concept you must remember is that calories are just a unit of measurement. Energy balance is important in relation with the golden rule I said in the first video. Calories in versus calories out. In fact, weight loss/gain is determined by how much energy you consume, calories in, versus how much energy you expend, calories out. Our body is an amazing machine with tens of thousands of metabolic reactions occurring simultaneously, all to make you live and breathe. Some of these reactions produce energy, but many of them require energy input. Even some of the most basic things, like maintaining your sodium/potassium gradient across your cell membranes, requires energy. But energy is basically a measurement. It's not a really tangible thing, so in order to provide this energy to run these functions, your body uses ATP, adenosine triphosphate. We can say that ATP is the gas that makes our body move. Many reactions require energy input to power them, and energy is measured as heat. So your body uses ATP to do so. In biochemistry, ATP is a 3 phosphates attached to an adenosine. Those 3 phosphate are high energy, and when ATP donates one of the 3 phosphate, its energy is passed to the reaction, and so we have our calories out part of the equation. Let's elaborate a bit more. We all know that exercise makes us burn calories, but why so? How ATP is used during exercise? There are quite few reasons, but let's start with the most basic. Locomotion requires energy. In order to move, your muscles have to contract, and the usage of ATP makes those contraction possible. Other reaction like increased heart rate will also requires more ATP, as it is involved in the process which makes your heart pump more blood. So how does ATP relate to you gaining or losing body fat? Is your fat just a bunch of stored ATP on your belly or on your love handles? Not really. ATP can't really be stored to any large degree because it's a very high energy molecule. So the body tends to only make the amount of ATP it needs at any given point. If you need more ATP, your body will produce it. But since you can't store ATP, our bodies has a different method to store energy. Guess what? Your fat tissue, it's a depot of energy that the body can use if he needs energy when the energy you eat is less than the energy you consume. Wait a second, but that's calories in versus calories out. Adipose tissue is made up of adipocytes, which are cells that store massive amounts of fats in the form of triglycerides. You can also store energy, mostly in your muscle and in your liver, from carbohydrates in the form of glycogen, but this storage is both limited to 300 to 400 grams. That's less than 1,000 grams of total carbohydrates, which are equivalent to less than 4,000 kilocalories. 1 gram of carbohydrate contains 4 kilocalories. While adipose tissue can store massive amounts of energy. Let's make an example. Take an average-sized, non-obese male at 80 kilograms and 15% body fat. That would be 12 kilograms of fat or 12,000 grams. Since 1 gram of fat contains 9 kcal, that means that is more than 100,000 calories of stored energy. Protein, the other major macronutrient in our diet, doesn't really have a storage mechanism. It can only be used for protein synthesis or oxidized for energy. That doesn't mean that you just expel them, as someone have claimed. Just because there isn't a storage depot for protein, it doesn't mean your body can't capture that energy another way. Proteins are made up of amino acids, and the body has a process to make energy out of them. One of the major ways is through gluconeogenesis, which permits to create glucose from non-carbohydrate substrates in the liver. Around 60% of the amino acids are gluconeogenic, and their carbon skeleton can be used to form glucose once nitrogen is removed. It is possible that this glucose can then be stored as glycogen and theoretically fat, but it's a small amount, since protein is a more inefficient energy storage source compared to carbohydrates and fats. This topic will be further analyzed. However, there is interplay between these three macronutrients inside the body. As I already said, the carbon skeletons from amino acids in protein can be converted to glucose, and glucose can actually be converted to fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis, which occurs in the liver and in the adipose tissue. Now keto supporters will say, so carbs makes us fat? The answer is no. Is over-consuming calories that makes you fat? The source of calories doesn't matter in this case. In fact, de novo lipogenesis actually contributes a very small amount of fat to body storage. In fact, a recent study examined overfeeding women by 50% above their maintenance calories. Through sophisticated methods, they were able to show exactly where the stored body fat within these women came from, carbs or fat. What did they find? That the female participants, on average, stored a total of 282 grams of fat per day in adipose. A measly 4 grams of that fat resulted from de novo lipogenesis, and 278 grams came from dietary fat. So carbs only contributed to 1.4% of fat gain during overfeeding in this study. So, if carbs aren't being stored as fat, then it must be dietary fat, right? Let's not jump to conclusion. Just as carbs have been the most recently demonized macronutrients, fats also had their trial. While it's easy to store dietary fat as body fat, that also depends on how much carbohydrate you consume. In fact, carbs and fats are the two main fuels that we use to produce ATP, and the intake of one affects the metabolism of the other. If you're on a high-carb diet, you might not store virtually any body fat from the carbohydrates themselves, but the carbohydrates increase the secretion of insulin, which impairs lipolysis, the breakdown of fat, and fat oxidation, the two crucial steps of fat burning. So are carbs that makes us fat? I say it once more. No, but you have to understand how our body works. If your caloric intake remains the same and you eat a higher carb diet, then by default you will eat less as a percentage of your daily calorie intake. While you may not store many of these carbs in the form of body fat, the increased carbohydrate intake will increase the efficiency at which you store dietary fats in adipose tissue. That's because your body will preferentially oxidize glucose, thereby sparing dietary fats for storage in adipose. If, on the contrary, you consume a high-fat, low-carb diet, you will burn a lot of fats because your carbs and insulin will be low, which increases the rate of lipolysis and fat oxidation. That's why your friend who's on keto will tell you that it's the best diet ever, because you're always burning fat. That it's true. But this statement is incomplete. You're burning a lot of fat because, guess what, you're also eating a lot of fat. Your net, and I repeat net, fat balance, fat oxidized versus fat stored, will determine overall loss of body fat. You now might be confused. What it is important to know is that as carb intake rises, fat oxidation goes down and carb oxidation goes up. As fat intake rises, carb oxidation lower and fat oxidation goes up. Same deal for fat storage, as carbohydrates intake goes up and fat intake goes down, you store less fat into adipose tissue. As fat intake goes up and carbohydrate intake goes down, you store more fat into adipose. So what's the meaning of this? It means that our body is extremely flexible in the kind of fuels it can use, and it will base its preference on what it's exposed to. Some might find it reasonable to suggest that a low-fat diet is probably better than a low-carb diet from a physiological perspective, because you store less total fat. In reality, however, it's not the rates of fat oxidation, carb oxidation, or fat storage that tell the tale of obesity. It's the rate of fat oxidation versus the rate of fat storage, and this is determined by overall energy balance, cico. Here it comes again. A lot of fitness influencer nowadays will try to convince you that the calories in, calories out. The cico model of obesity is antiquated and has been debunked, but I'll explain you why this is not true. I want to be clear, different diets equal in energy/calories can have different effect on fat loss based on their macronutrient compositions. I'll explain this in depth later, but that doesn't not invalidate in any way energy balance. It simply means these diets affect energy output in some way. In order to understand why energy balance matters, we first need to explain the components that make up calories in and calories out. The first one, calories in, is exactly what it sounds like. This side of the energy balance equation is simple. How many calories did you eat in a day? The latter, calories out side of the energy balance equation, is a little bit more tricky. Calories out, also known as TDE or total daily energy expenditure, is made of 4 pieces. 1. Basal metabolic rate, BMR. 2. Non-exercise adaptive thermogenesis, NEAT. 3. Exercise activity, EA. 4. Thermic effect of food, TEF. Basal metabolic rate, BMR, is the major component of your TDE. In fact, your BMR accounts approximately 60% of your TDE and is the amount of energy your body needs to run its vital functions, just to keep you alive. Non-exercise adaptive thermogenesis, NEAT, is the amount of energy you spend doing unconscious movements, like fidgeting or walking, just to make an example, throughout the day that aren't actually exercise. This is actually the most adaptive component of metabolism, and it increases significantly during a caloric surplus and decreases significantly during a calorie deficit. In fact, when our body senses a calorie deficit, it tries to go on a save mode, like your smartphone battery, and starts to cut off non-necessary energy-consuming activities in order to save up energy to run vital process. So you feel like you just want to stay on the couch watching TV rather than go out for a walk. Thermic effect of food, it may sound strange, but it exists. So what it is? It means that it costs energy to extract the energy contained in the food you eat every day. It happens during digestion when you break down what you eat to its macronutrient/micronutrients. However, the conversion to energy isn't perfect, so if you eat 100 kilocalories worth of food, you won't get 100 kilocalories of energy, but less. Also, different foods requires different amounts of energy to be processed and digested. Generally speaking, food high in protein or in fiber have a higher TEF, and also have more satiating effect. Exercise activity, just like it sounds. When you exercise, you burn calories. How many depends on the duration and intensity of the exercise, and remember, cardio burns more calories than weightlifting. So in the end, TDE is the sum of BMR plus NEAT plus TEF plus exercise. Well, it looks simply, but it's not the straight. In fact, your TDE may vary from day to day depending upon your activity, food intake, and many other factors, like stress. So trying to determine the exact number is quite difficult, but that doesn't mean that the equation cico, it's not true. It just means the calories out part of the equation can vary, but it's not a huge variation if you have a consistent routine, and so we can get close to that number, and there are ways, however, to deal with this, as I'll explain in much greater detail. Several groups of diet zealots, including hardcore clean eaters, keto diet zealots, hardline vegans, and a host of others, have attempted to discredit the cico model as outdated. One of the major arguments many of these groups propose is that cico is based on the first law of thermodynamics, which only applies to a closed system. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only be transferred. This applies to cico because the energy we put into the system, our body, cannot just disappear. It has to be used somehow, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's conserved in your body since it isn't a closed system. All the energy you take in is not perfectly conserved into the body. In fact, your body can dissipate quite a bit of energy as heat through the process of adaptive thermogenesis. What cico critics don't realize is that dissipation of energy is already accounted for in the calories out part of equation, since NEAT actually includes the dissipation of energy. So while energy is no perfectly conserved in the human body, our calculations already consider this aspect. Further, while the human body is not a closed system, the various components of calories out, TDE, already take into account that the human body is an open system, making this argument a strawman. So if you eat 2,000 calories, something happens to them. They won't all wind up as ATP or stored, and some will be wasted as heat through the process of thermogenesis, but this doesn't invalidate cico, on the contrary. It supports it. This also means that if any diet were superior to another one, it would need to affect one of the components of TDE in a meaningful way and cause an increase in caloric expenditure compared to other calorie-equated diets. For example, if a specific diet increases TDE by 300 kilocalories per day, that would improve fat loss due to increased expenditure, or calories out. If a diet also caused a shift to favoring increased weight loss from fat tissue versus lean body mass, that would be an additional benefit. Any potential benefit of a diet on energy expenditure can be explained based on the formula of TDE, which is equal to BMR plus NEAT plus TEF plus exercise. Numerous metabolic ward studies support these findings, demonstrating that when calories and protein are equated, weight loss is the same. Metabolic ward studies are important because they are extremely tightly controlled. The patients are provided their meals by the researcher, and the researchers place them in a room where they can measure their TDE based on a few fancy techniques. Some of the purported superior fat loss effect of various diets, such as ketogenic diet, can actually be traced back to the fact that some people are more satiated by a ketogenic diet and simply eat fewer total calories. Also, an important thing that I want to point out now, regarding keto diet, refers to the initial drop in body weight, which is very high. Well, you're losing a bunch of weight, up to 2.5 kilograms, but you're not actually losing body fat, but water. That happens because you have less glycogen, carbohydrates, stored in your body. And every gram of glycogen bonds with 3 grams of water, so if you have less glycogen stored in your liver and in your muscle, you'll have by consequence less water, therefore less weight. So the total amount of weight loss is mostly composed by water, not fat. The fact that many nutrition studies do not equate for calories when comparing diets is a huge drawback in much of the nutrition research, and it's mind-blowing that more people aren't aware of it. Now, if certain diets help with satiety and cause people to eat less, then there is potential value in those diets. Helping with satiety yield a decrease in energy intake is much different than some of the claims you hear about good calories or bad calories, and the types of calories you consume are more important than the quantity of calories you eat. The low-carb keto proponents have gone as far as to say that you can gain fat while in a caloric deficit if you're eating carbohydrates because insulin drives obesity, not calories. Wrong. This claim revolves around the carbohydrate-insulin hypothesis of obesity, whereby insulin, a hormone that helps shuttle glucose into cells, is postulated to drive fat gain and obesity due to its inhibition on lipolysis and fat oxidation. If insulin truly had that powerful effect and caused people to gain fat, then it must be somehow affecting one of the components of TDE, thereby lowering your daily TDE and thus creating a caloric surplus and tipping energy balance towards storage. The idea that eating carbs can cause you to gain fat, even if you're in a deficit, is completely false claim. If eating any amount of carbs caused you to gain fat, regardless of your caloric intake, that would mean that carbs must somehow cause your BMR, NEAT or EA to go into the tank. Research doesn't support this evidence in any way. I'll talk about this later, but for now I just want to point out that the carbohydrate insulin model of weight gain and loss has been disproven several times over by several studies. I want to be very clear, it is impossible to gain weight during a calorie deficit. If you gained weight, then you're not in a calorie deficit, but in a surplus. There are no other explanations. So when you say I ate in a deficit and gained weight, this probably means you calculated your TDE using an equation that estimates your TDE based on some parameters like height, weight, body fat percentage, and then calculated their estimated deficit, which in reality is superior to their real TDE, and so they were in a caloric surplus. Although they thought they were in a deficit, that's why can't lose the weight. The idea that the type of calories is more important than the quantity is simply untrue, and has been demonstrated through a number of studies. However, that isn't to say that the types of calories you consume don't matter at all. They do. But for other aspect, like building or preserving muscle mass or health-related aspect. Also, a plethora of studies have demonstrated an increased weight/fat loss and energy expenditure with diets that are higher in proteins. That because proteins have an higher TEF, and so you burn more calories while digesting those proteins. In fact, when you compared the TEF of protein with the TEF of carbohydrates, that becomes immediately clear. The TEF of protein is approximately 20 to 30%, whereas carbohydrates are approximately 5 to 10%, and fats just 0 to 3%. There have been various theories as to why protein is such an inefficient nutrient compared to carbohydrate and fat, but it's likely due to the effect of dietary protein on overall protein turnover. You see, when sufficient protein is ingested, it increases muscle protein turnover and muscle protein synthesis. Muscle protein turnover is an ATP-requiring, energetically expensive process and may increase the usage of ATP and thermogenesis. Dietary protein also improves the retention of lean body mass during caloric restriction, meaning more fat loss and less lean mass lost. This may help maintain metabolic rate better and assist you in limiting body fat regain post-diet. Not only the protein content of the diet appear to affect TEF and fat loss, but fiber also seems to have a similar effect on reducing body weight when consumed. This is likely due to a portion of fiber being not metabolizable, which would effectively reduce its net calorie contribution. Moreover, fiber are really satiating and keeps you from consuming more calories. In fact, if calories, protein and fiber are equated, the effect of the ratio of carbohydrate to fat appears to have zero influence on fat loss. This aspect will be analyzed in the video regarding macronutrients. Based on the research data I've presented in this video, two things are apparent. The first is, not all sources of calories are created equal, meaning they don't all produce equal weight gain or loss depending upon the macronutrient breakdown of different diets. The second is that the quantity of calories you consume still matters more than the source of calories you consume. TEF, while important, is still only about 15% of the TD, so you can't just eat as much protein as you want and lose weight. Let's make it more clear with numbers. If you were on a 2000 kilocalories per day diet and you consume 400 kilocalories from protein, 800 kilocalories from carbohydrates, and 800 kilocalories from fat, you should end up with a net of 1796 kilocalories based on TEF of each macronutrient, assuming a TEF of 30%, 7.5%, and 3% respectively. If you doubled your protein to 200 grams per day and got 800 kilocalories from protein, 600 kilocalories from carbohydrates and 600 kilocalories from fats, then you would end up with a net of 1697 kilocalories. So effectively, you have reduced your net calories by 100 kilocalories. This is nice, but it hardly justifies eating more protein just because it's more thermogenic. If we use the previous example of a person who increases his protein from 100 grams to 200 grams, but doesn't decrease their carbohydrate and fat intake, then we end up with a net calorie amount of 2076. If this person's maintenance calories were 1900, for example, increasing their protein, without reducing carbs or fat to compensate, would have actually led to weight gain. This is why calorie intake is more important, and it's the most determinant factor of weight loss. So your focus has to be on total calories you eat. Still, others will attempt to discredit or question the cico model by bringing up topics like thyroid hormone. Many people have said that cico doesn't work and they can't lose weight because they have low thyroid hormone or some other stuff. While low thyroid hormone can indeed make it more difficult to lose weight due to reduced BMR, that again doesn't negate cico or energy balance. It simply means the calories out portion of the equation is less than you would predict because BMR is lower. In the next video we will talking about the body self-defense system. Hope you like the video. If so, please leave a comment, like, share with your friends and subscribe to the channel. Let's make one more step towards success.